Mark's Headroom, episode 17, where I break a 5-day fast, talk for a few minutes before that. Today, I thought about talking about working from the heart. You know, when you work from the heart, you're always vulnerable in this world. Always. Every relationship that you have, every person you encounter, you take a bit of a risk that they're not, that they're working from some other objective or motive. The heart is very pure, and altruism is rare. And when you find yourself working from altruism and from your heart in your life, you're taking risk. I was known as a risk taker, even in the oil business. And I've been a risk taker in every aspect of my life. And I would say, beware. And I see it's like kind of like one of my acting coaches, my first mentor in the film and acting business was Cliff Osmond, and he kind of he said something to me. I was probably around 30 years old, and he was like, this could hurt, and it did. Many times I've felt that, and but there is something that just keeps calling me back to continue to not give up on working from the heart. And I look at college athletes, and I'm so pleased to see the evolution of the business side of sports, at least beginning to limit the exploitation of people's dreams and aspirations in life. A lot of people didn't really love sports or athletics or combat or even violence, but it was a way out of the despair or the economic situation that they found themselves in high school or college. But for the most part, most everyone, except maybe there's a special 1% that actually ended up making a lifetime out of it, whether it was on the field or court, or perhaps in a broadcast booth talking about the game to people today. And it's wonderful for the people that worked out for. But there's millions of people that were, and this is where there's some denial. And the truth of the matter is they were betrayed by their maybe by themselves for not recognizing more of the truth of the matter is that they were working for slave wages, taking risk with their body and doing harm. Brain injuries, joint injuries. I mean, they're all, who knows what the toll is, but in any event, if you do love a sport or you love something about it, maybe it's like me. I had a connection with other men, especially when I played basketball, and that was very, very supportive to my journey. And I felt like I was working from my heart, even in my 30s and early 40s when I continued to play pretty highly competitive basketball. That love of the connection and everything that it kind of brought me a more like a wholeness where you had everyone with a common goal and on your team, and that felt like something that was unusual for me in business. And I didn't even feel that way at most of the church groups that I've been a part of in my entire life. And even in family, it seems like you're commonly at odds, um, picking up the pieces. And so even though in family, I think, you try to work from your heart, but you find there's a lot of ancestral and a lot of things that are handed down that you end up ferreting out as lessons and learning more about relationship issues. At least that's my take on it, having raised 8 kids and been in 3 long-term relationships with with women, and even with my mother, who's still alive at 84. I think it's been a real interesting period of my life since my father died about 16 years ago, and she and I have gotten to be a lot closer than we were prior to that. So I've learned a lot about myself and a lot about her and a lot about my community that I was raised in. Love is so powerful, and it's interesting. One of the things I've noticed in the like the well, y'all have heard me talk about my early exposure to the King James version of the Bible, and the version that I first learned um, used like in the famous, I think it's Corinthians 13 or First Corinthians 13 was or Second Corinthians 13. I don't really try to ever remember the chapter and book. I mean, it's commonly the phrase that I latch on to. That aside, um, the book and chapter on love. Well, the word that I learned first was charity, and later they changed it to love. And I'm not sure how much later, but the first version, one of the older versions of the King James Bible, used the word charity rather than love. And I think love today is more transactional. Charity, that seems to have an open end to it, and it seems to have. I mean, as I throw that word out to people, I notice that there's a quite a difference between how they react to the word love or the word charity. Love, in its truest form, is charity. There's nothing that's expected in return. Charity, on the other hand, today is often seems to have, and I may be biased here in reading something into the cards or the circumstances that I'm observing, but charity seems to have more of a well, are you seeing that I'm doing this? Do I get credit for this? And so there is still a transactional side that I think is around charity in the world today as the word has evolved, and people want to be seen and known for being a uh, a charitable person or a giving person or a humble person. And I think anytime that becomes an objective or a motive that is deliberately pursued, it's very, very challenging. I mean, I think a lot of the masters in of of the ages, once the ego enters in, it's all over. And once you're trying to present an image or an identity, there's some thinking, there's some brain um, stuff that's involved that hardly can stay away from making it transactional. And I think that's the one of the challenges that we have with capitalism today is that finding a way to trade um, with respect to maintaining the human dignity and not taking advantage of people. Because going back to the athletics, the owners, the teams, the sporting teams that made great profits off of individuals. Say you were playing football in the 50s or 60s, or basketball or baseball, whatever. A lot of those people didn't make a fraction of what the franchises made, and ultimately, the business enterprises that were really taking advantage of the people doing something that they were aspiring to maybe it was for getting recognition or fame, or potentially a fortune or a greater fortune than they were afforded doing a job as an electrician or as an engineer or as a tradesman or as a barber or some other function in the community, to have a role and be known at the national level. I think I was watching an ESPN thing the other day, and Newt Rockney was on there, and I was surprised at there's such a difference in the early 70s and mid 70s and the salaries and the lifestyles even that these guys had. Even though they were elevated above the normal, they still were not even near the level of the lifestyles afforded those that owned the teams and the franchises and the branding and the networks. So, little side note on being taken advantage of for the things that you love, or you're naive to. Maybe you want, I mean, maybe you have new money, and that puts you in a different field of encounters. Your circumstances are entirely different if you've been given, let's say, well, like me. I had $1 billion to start an oil company once from a private equity firm, and it changed the way everyone around me acted. And that was a hard time because the money didn't change. I won't say it didn't change me, but it certainly um, gave me a lot of insight into myself and how I operate, because I ultimately um, determined that it was not going to be my master. And I don't know where that came from necessarily, but I think it probably comes from the spirit and maybe some early childhood stuff. Who knows? I'm not going to, I'm not. I have no idea. I'm stumbling now as to what to do with that. But I do understand matters of the heart better than trying to explain those half steps that you make toward compromise, toward money, or what can you live with and what can you not, and knowing those boundaries between your own dignity and where you're betraying yourself or betraying others that are counting on you. So I think that there's a lot of relationships that we have in our lives that are, because if you are operating in the world, you're going to have to consider what is your boundary between love and the dignity and values that you have for the responsibilities that you've made, the commitments you've made to other people. So anytime that you are operating from your heart, it is an examination at some point of the other people in your life, and how authentic and how real they are. And I think the athletics is a an aspect of that. I just watched a documentary on Sean Combs, and you could see how the rappers, who were exploding in the 80s and maybe the 70s as well, from New York City, Brooklyn, Manhattan, LA, and how they were so aspiring and so eager, and they carried with them this primal connection to their their art, just as athletes carry a primal connection to their body that gives them a advantage on the court or field, in the speed and violence and the strength that they bring to their game. And I think, the same type of level of commitment, was in these people that were mostly, raised in poverty and violent attitude and violent environments where they were really struggling with the culture that they had been. A lot of these people were African Americans, so they were. I believe that they were still feeling the uh, the rage against trying to be forced to fit into a culture here that was entirely different than their where they were kidnapped and forced, taken by duress, and put into maybe two or three, four, five generations of slavery or more. I'm not a historian on that. I'm just speaking in round numbers there, but I think that those people were really, incredible artists. And even though, some of the things that evolved between the men and the women around sexuality and the drugs and dealing with the fortune that was suddenly, available to some of those people who were most dominant, but they still found themselves in a operating from that tribal um, place and not their heart. And I think there were a few artists that were able to build a field and set of circumstances and relationships around them that did. I'm not trying to throw them all into that category, but it does seem like especially when you see the story of Sean Combs and all of the several circumstances around him where people were very much victims of being exploited for their aspirations. So those are my thoughts about working from the heart. I think it's interesting to find what people bring up around working from the heart, around that, having a conversation about that, whether it's around maybe religion or spirituality, or if it's at work and business and doing what you love. And of course, in family and in relationships, I think, um, one of the powerful views or things to consider is a person's relationship, as they get older with their children and their own parents and family as well as their community. And there's a fascinating dynamic that changes as people, kind of leave the rat race that they may be in and trying to keep up with the Joneses and if you're in a cutthroat industry or a career track, how you hold up under that and how your heart holds up. And so anyway, I'd be interested in other people's comments. It seems like I'm putting a lot out here. I'm being very revealing of myself and putting myself consistently into a state of openness and vulnerability here. And it's interesting. The algorithm seems to be pushing me out to overseas more than the U.S. So I've started putting some of this on TikTok and on Substack in addition to YouTube, and as well as I have roachcreative.com where I have recently published some information that addresses what was the most recent, some shadow work that I think is really important to help people claim their wholeness. And actually, it's an avenue to really know what's in your heart. Have a great week. Hope the holidays are great to you. We'll see you next week.